Look at a standard economic model of optimal taxation, and you will find a strictly frictionless environment. The mathematical architecture assumes perfect enforcement with zero evasion and perfect administration with zero collection costs. Apply that model to the physical reality of the developing world, and the math fails. In many low-income nations, governments struggle to capture even 15% of their total economic output in taxes. Modern public finance has largely attributed this failure to a lack of information trails, the third-party data generated by corporate payrolls and centralized banking. In a highly formalized economy, instruments like the value-added tax are effectively self-enforcing. Because firms must provide invoices to claim their own tax deductions, they naturally create a paper trail that tracks every transaction up the supply chain. High levels of informality and cash-based commerce break these reporting loops. Invoice mills falsify documents and transactions slip off the books, leaving large segments of the economy unmeasured and untaxed. Relying strictly on information trails represents a passive approach. It requires states to wait decades for slow structural economic transformation before they gain meaningful leverage over their own revenue. To raise revenue immediately, developing states must actively engineer their tax capacity from the ground up, utilizing two specific mechanisms. The first mechanism is the physical machinery of the state, the sinews. This requires adopting elements of Max Weber's classical bureaucratic ideal, a centralized hierarchical administration capable of locating assets, calculating liabilities, and executing collections. The second mechanism is the soul, the societal legitimacy of the government itself. Quasi-voluntary compliance from the public is the only factor that prevents mass evasion or open tax revolts. By treating tax capacity as an equation, administration multiplied by legitimacy, we can test the effectiveness of these variables using recent randomized controlled trials from across the developing world. In low-capacity states, administration determines the limits of tax policy. Weber's bureaucratic blueprint relies heavily on intense structural specialization. He argued that rational public management requires dividing labor so that civil servants can develop narrow technical expertise. To test this, the Indonesian government overhauled its corporate tax structure by creating dedicated medium taxpayer offices. They pulled high-skill auditors and account representatives from general pools and assigned them exclusively to monitor specific tiers of corporate taxpayers. Concentrating specialized staff removed a major friction in the tax code: size-dependent enforcement. Under the specialized units, scrutiny remained constant, even as firms grew, giving businesses the confidence to expand and accurately report their revenue. The financial result of this specialization was immediate. Corporate tax collections in these offices rose by 64% initially, accelerating to a 128% increase over 6 years. Weber also insisted on strict personnel management, specifically filling those specialized roles through civil service exams to build an academically credentialed workforce. In highly informal economies, academic credentials often matter less than asymmetrical local knowledge. Identifying taxable assets in an undocumented environment requires granular, on-the-ground intelligence that university graduates rarely possess. A randomized trial in the Democratic Republic of Congo tested this. Deputizing local city chiefs to collect property taxes instead of formal state agents increased collections by 44%. The chiefs used intimate neighborhood knowledge to target households with a higher ability to pay. Weber's framework also demands rigid, seniority-based promotion. Yet in Pakistan, introducing a 30% performance pay benchmark for property tax collectors yielded a 62% jump in total revenue, without an increase in corrupt assessments. The bureaucratic scaffolding, specialized structures, and managed personnel is essential for capacity. However, developing states must modify Weber's internal rules to leverage local realities in informal economies. That adaptation leads to the final administrative variable, task management, and the dilemma of bureaucratic discretion. Granting field agents broad discretion over how and who they tax is risky. In cash-heavy environments, unstructured autonomy routinely generates bribery, extortion, and regressive tax assessments. Conversely, eliminating that discretion strips the agent of their ability to read and navigate chaotic urban environments where algorithms often fail. A property tax intervention in Ghana identified the optimal technological compromise, utilizing technology to regularize the agent's lowest-level tasks. The state equipped tax collectors with GPS-enabled tablets loaded with geospatial property data. This immediately standardized the mechanical process of finding the correct house and delivering the correct bill. Reducing the time spent navigating allowed agents to focus on high-value discretion. They could use their localized knowledge to determine exactly which high-yield properties to target for follow-up collection visits. This ultimately doubled collections. The goal of technology in this context is to establish guardrails. By automating the mechanical tasks, the state maximizes the value of human intuition. Coercive administrative efficiency has a hard ceiling. Sustaining tax capacity requires the soul, the quasi-voluntary compliance of a public that views the state as legitimate. The supply-driven hypothesis suggests that if governments proactively supply highly visible public goods like roads or clinics, citizens will reciprocate by paying their taxes. Empirical data suggests otherwise. In Freetown, Sierra Leone, a municipal initiative allowed citizens to actively choose new local public goods through digital town halls. Despite the investment in services, researchers found zero average increase in property tax compliance. The supply-driven model falters against human behavioral economics. Citizens often free ride on public goods, and expectations for infrastructure frequently exceed what a nascent tax base can actually fund. Instead, the data points to a demand-driven reality. State legitimacy is forged through the friction of tax enforcement itself. Consider the Congolese city of Kananga, where the state initiated its first comprehensive door-to-door property tax collection campaign. The sudden enforcement of a financial levy generated an immediate behavioral response. Citizens subjected to the tax visits began participating in town halls at higher rates and actively demanding transparency on how their money was spent. The social contract is a product of bargaining. Citizens demand institutional constraints in exchange for their money, and legitimacy is the byproduct of that bargain. We have analyzed the micromechanics of administration and the behavioral drivers of legitimacy. How do these two variables interact at a macro level? Plotting cross-country data, nations with more tax staff and meritocratic recruitment extract a higher percentage of GDP in taxes. Factoring in perceived legitimacy, these variables interact multiplicatively. Administrative reforms yield drastically steeper tax returns only in countries possessing high legitimacy. Legitimate governments encounter less daily resistance from taxpayers, lowering the cost of enforcement. They also attract highly motivated civil servants who maximize the technical tools they are given. A perfectly efficient Weberian bureaucracy remains ineffective when it serves a predatory, illegitimate state. Its yield will remain capped by the level of public trust. If the blueprint for state capacity is documented in the data, why do political elites in the developing world routinely block these reforms? The historical catalyst for the administrative revolution was military survival. Gunpowder and the rising cost of standing armies created existential threats for rulers. Facing insolvency, European rulers abandoned lucrative patronage networks and professionalized their tax departments to fund their survival. War forced the creation of the modern state. Today, developing nations generally face fewer existential border wars. Without that pressure, elites have less incentive to disrupt a low-tax status quo. Overcoming this requires forming domestic elite pacts and exploiting local political competition to force change. Setting optimal tax rates is an empty exercise if a government lacks the machinery required to enforce them. Economic modernization alone won't create a high-capacity tax state. It requires a deliberate, engineered equilibrium of